The machine screamed before anyone else did, a sound like metal tearing itself apart as the lights of the chamber flickered and every alien present recoiled in instinctive terror, because the Verity engine had never made a sound in the history of the Galactic Concord, not once across 1,000,000 interrogations, not until the moment the human mind touched it. Ambassador Elias Ward stood alone at the center of the floor, hands folded, breathing steady, while translucent cables of light wrapped around his skull, and for the first time, the galaxy's most trusted truth-reading device began to overheat. The delegates did not yet know why they were afraid, only that something impossible had just happened, and impossibility was not supposed to exist anymore. The Concord chamber hung in orbit above a dead blue star, vast enough to swallow cities, its walls lined with beings who had never lied and had never needed to, species whose evolution had stripped deception away like a useless organ, leaving behind civilizations built on perfect trust and flawless prediction. They had summoned humanity here because humans were new, strange and loud in the cosmic sense, but still assumed to be understandable, and now the machine designed to understand all minds was breaking apart around a single man who looked almost bored. The translators whispered panic into 1,000 languages as warning glyphs bloomed red across the air, and someone in the upper tiers began to pray to a future that was no longer answering. Elias felt the heat spike against his temples and tasted copper as the Verity engine pushed deeper, trying to extract a single clean truth and finding instead a storm. He thought of nothing in particular and everything at once, memories folding over imagined outcomes, lies he had told as a child, colliding with futures that would never exist, and the engine reacted like a calculator fed infinity. The presiding speaker, a many-eyed being of the Keth Collective, leaned forward and demanded the test be halted, because according to every model they possessed, this level of system strain preceded catastrophic failure. But the humans' handlers did not move, because this was exactly what Earth Command had predicted would happen. Humanity had not come to be judged, it had come to demonstrate. Long before the stars heard their radio noise, humans had learned to lie, not as a flaw, but as a survival trait, to imagine threats that were not yet real and prepare for them anyway, to pretend confidence while terrified, to tell themselves stories about tomorrow so they could endure today. On Earth, this was called anxiety, hope, strategy, faith, self-deception, planning, and sometimes madness. But to the galaxy, it was an unknown force, a cognitive weapon disguised as chaos. The Verity engine attempted to isolate a single statement from Elias Ward's mind, a single answer to the question, "Do you come in peace?" And instead it detected simultaneous contradictory states, sincerity and calculation existing at the same time, layered like ghosts occupying the same body. Peace was desired. Peace was doubted, peace was a mask, peace was a tactic, peace was a lie told in case peace failed, and the machine could not decide which was true, because for the first time, all of them were. The chamber erupted as the engine vented energy into the void, fracturing predictive subroutines that had guided fleets and empires for centuries. And somewhere far away, a navigation array misfired. A trade convoy vanished from its expected arrival window, and the first ripple of uncertainty spread through the galaxy. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm, almost gentle, as if addressing a nervous audience back home who would one day hear this recording and lean closer without realizing why. And he said that humans were honored by the Concord's attention and grateful for the chance to be understood. The words were true, and they were not, and the Verity engine's core cracked in response. The speaker demanded to know what humanity was hiding, because no mind should be able to destabilize a device that read the universe itself. And Elias met 1,000 alien gazes and smiled, not as a threat, but as a warning wrapped in politeness.
He explained that humans did not experience thought as a straight line, but as a branching explosion, that they rehearsed disasters before they happened and lived entire lives in their heads that never came to pass, that they could believe in a future strongly enough to die for it even if it was built on a lie, and that this ability had allowed them to survive predators, plagues, and themselves. The translators struggled because there was no word in any alien language for imagining something you knew was false and acting on it anyway, and the delay only heightened the fear. Deep within the Concorde's data vaults, probability engines began to return null results whenever human variables were introduced, futures blurring into static, predictions collapsing into maybes, and the galaxy's greatest strength, certainty, began to rot from the inside. Elias felt the cables detach as the Verity engine finally shut itself down to prevent total annihilation, leaving behind silence so heavy it felt like gravity had increased. And in that silence, the speaker asked a question no being had ever needed to ask before. If you cannot be read, how can you be trusted? Elias answered honestly, which was the most dangerous option of all, and said that humans trusted each other every day without certainty, that they built civilizations on promises they knew could be broken, that they planned wars they hoped would never happen, and that if the galaxy was afraid now, it was only because it had just met a species that could look at the future, see 10,000 ways to lose, and choose to act anyway. Somewhere among the observers, a quiet thought spread like a contagion, the kind that makes listeners want to stay, to listen again, to follow what comes next even when it scares them. Because the humans were not just unpredictable, they were unreadable by reality itself. As emergency lights dimmed and the Concorde prepared to recess for the first time in its history, a sealed military channel lit up on a distant world, because several empires had independently reached the same conclusion, and none of them liked it.
The chamber did not empty in panic, but in calculation, because fear without prediction was a new sensation, and every species present reacted differently to it. Some freezing in place, others retreating behind shields that had never before been raised inside the Concorde, while Elias Ward was escorted out beneath a dome of humming light as if he were a volatile substance rather than a diplomat. Outside the chamber, unseen by him, the Concorde's central foresight lattice attempted to rerun the last 10 minutes of recorded reality and failed every time, timelines snapping apart the moment the human variable was introduced, and for the first time in recorded galactic history, the future refused to load. On the bridge of the Keth flagship, analysts whispered that this was impossible and therefore unacceptable because their civilization had been built on the assumption that all outcomes could be known if enough data was gathered, and now a single mind had turned certainty into a rumor. Elias was led through corridors of living crystal toward a holding suite designed for comfort, not confinement, and as he walked, he allowed his thoughts to drift deliberately, imagining escape routes he would never take, conversations that would never happen, betrayals that were not planned but could be if necessary. And somewhere deep in the station, another predictive node glitched and went dark. Humanity's observers were listening, scattered across human space, men and women who understood that this moment was bigger than first contact. And if you were hearing this now, leaning closer without realizing why, it was because that instinct to stay and listen was the same one that had carried humans through darker nights than this. In the council's private chamber, the speaker convened an emergency quorum of the eldest species, those who remembered the era before prediction engines ruled everything, and they spoke in tones stripped of ceremony because decorum felt fragile now. They asked whether the human was a threat or an anomaly, and the answer came back fractured, because threat assessment models required intent, and intent could not be isolated inside a mind that contained mutually exclusive futures at the same time.
A representative of the Ulari, whose fleets navigated by probability currents, reported that their long-range routes were destabilizing whenever human ships appeared in nearby sectors, as if space-time itself hesitated in their presence. Another delegate admitted that their internal governance algorithms had begun returning contradictory policy outcomes after ingesting human cultural data, unable to reconcile stories where heroes lied, villains told the truth, and sacrifice was sometimes based on beliefs known to be false. The conclusion they circled was unspoken but heavy, that humans were not merely unreadable, they were corrosive to systems built on honesty. Elias sat alone in his suite, staring out at the dead blue star, and allowed himself a moment of genuine fear, because he knew what came next in stories like this, the quiet decision to remove the unknown variable before it spread. He also knew that fear was useful because it sharpened imagination, and imagination was humanity's true edge.
He rehearsed 100 futures where he was detained, executed, rescued, betrayed by his own species, and in each one he adjusted a detail, a tone, a pause, until he found the version that felt most likely to provoke hesitation in his captors. When the door chimed and a delegation entered without guards, he smiled, not because he was confident, but because confidence was one of the masks humans wore best. The speaker asked him directly whether humanity intended to weaponize this cognitive anomaly, and Elias answered with layered honesty, saying that humans had already weaponized it long ago without realizing, that every war plan, every deterrent, every mutually assured destruction scenario was built on imagined futures that never happened but still shaped behavior, and that this was not a choice but a condition. The aliens recoiled at that, because a condition could not be negotiated with, and one of them asked the question that had begun to echo across the Concord: "How do we predict you?" Elias told them they didn't, that prediction was not how humans survived uncertainty, that they prepared for it instead, building redundancies, lies, myths, and backup plans upon backup plans, accepting inefficiency in exchange for resilience. In the data vaults, a sealed report compiled itself without authorization, correlating historical anomalies across the galaxy, wars that had inexplicably gone wrong, empires that had collapsed despite perfect forecasts, and the pattern emerging was chilling, because in several cases a human presence had been nearby, advising, trading, or simply telling stories. The report's title was generated automatically, and when it appeared on the speaker's console, the room fell silent because it labeled humanity not as an unknown, but as a Class 7 uncertainty generator. Outside the station, fleets shifted positions subtly, not in aggression, but in preparation, and for the first time armadas trained on possibilities rather than probabilities. Elias sensed the change without seeing it, the way humans often did, a tightening in the narrative, and he realized that the galaxy was beginning to understand not just what humans were, but what they could do. As the delegation withdrew, leaving him alone again, a private channel flickered to life on his wrist, unauthorized and faint, carrying a single message from Earth Command that read simply, "Phase 1 confirmed. Proceed to Phase 2." Elias closed his eyes and imagined the galaxy realizing too late that Phase 2 did not require their cooperation, only their assumptions. Phase 2 began without a declaration because humans understood that the most dangerous actions were the ones that looked like accidents, and across the Concord's network, a series of minor, deniable irregularities started to appear, each too small to trigger alarms on its own, but together forming a pattern no prediction engine could reconcile.
Shipping delays occurred where no obstruction existed. Diplomatic messages arrived slightly out of order, and probability forecasts began to include footnotes expressing uncertainty, a concept so alien that several species halted deliberations entirely while trying to interpret it. Elias Ward was summoned again, not to the grand chamber, but to a smaller room designed for private truth exchange, its walls bare, its systems deliberately disconnected from the main lattice, because the Concorde was learning through trial and error that isolation was the only way to think clearly around humans. The speaker arrived alone, eyes dimmed, posture altered in ways that signaled stress even to a species unfamiliar with deception, and asked Elias if these disturbances were intentional. Elias told the truth in the way humans did best, by answering a different question, explaining that when humans faced an enemy who could see every move in advance, they learned to make moves that meant nothing until the last moment, rehearsing chaos so thoroughly that order could be assembled on the fly. He said that humans' history was full of plans designed to fail visibly so that the real plan could succeed invisibly, and that what the Concorde was experiencing now was not sabotage but acclamation. In the speaker's mind, that explanation triggered a cascade of impossible implications because it suggested that humans did not need certainty to act effectively, and worse, that they might be able to exploit species who did. In the Concorde's military annex, strategists attempted to simulate a hypothetical conflict with humanity and found that every model either looped infinitely or terminated in contradiction because human responses could not be bounded by rational self-interest alone, factoring in pride, fear, spite, hope, and stories of past wars that had ended in mutual ruin but were still considered victories. One analyst whispered that humans could bluff extinction and mean it emotionally, even if they did not mean it strategically, and the room fell quiet, because emotional truth was something their systems could not parse.
Elias returned to his suite and recorded a personal log, knowing it would be intercepted, and spoke aloud about missing Earth's oceans, about wondering if he would ever see home again, about doubting whether this mission was worth the risk. And each word was genuine enough to pass human standards, while simultaneously serving as a lure, because doubt was contagious, and he wanted the Concorde to feel it. Somewhere deep in the station, a junior technician noticed that the future projection array had begun producing branching narratives instead of single outcomes whenever human speech was introduced, and before they could report it, the array shut itself down to avoid what it classified as narrative overload. Across the galaxy, allied empires began to quietly share data about human interactions, comparing notes, and discovering with growing unease that humans seemed to perform better under conditions of uncertainty, adapting faster when plans collapsed, improvising solutions in real time that no algorithm had proposed. The idea spread that humanity was not simply unpredictable, but anti-fragile, growing more effective the more chaotic the environment became, and that realization hit like a cold wave, because the Concorde's greatest weapons were designed to impose order, not break it. In a closed session, the elders debated preemptive containment, arguing that a species that could not be predicted could not be allowed full access to a system built on foresight, and a motion was drafted to restrict human movement, trade, and information flow until further study could be completed. The vote was nearly unanimous because caution was the closest thing the Concorde had to fear. Elias was informed of the restrictions with polite formality, and he nodded, thanked them, and asked a single question in return, whether the Concorde's models had accounted for how humans would respond to being boxed in. The speaker admitted that they could not, and in that admission a subtle shift occurred, because acknowledging ignorance weakened the authority of every forecast that came before it.
That night, while the station slept, a classified alert rippled through the Concorde's defense network, reporting anomalous movement in a distant sector where no threat had been predicted, an ancient empire's armada emerging from dark space along vectors that should have been impossible according to every known model. As analysts scrambled, one of them cross-referenced the anomaly with recent human cultural transmissions and froze because the pattern matched a human war story about an enemy striking from the place no one was watching. By the time the speaker was awakened, the realization had already set in that humanity might not be the only species capable of lying to reality, but it was the first to teach the galaxy how.
The Concorde's council reconvened in emergency, every delegate present, every eye and sensor trained on Elias Ward. But no one spoke first, because silence was safer than assumption when uncertainty was contagious. Outside the observation windows, fleets shimmered like constellations being rearranged, every formation subtly off from predicted vectors, every patrol just a little faster or slower than the models expected, and the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. Elias entered the chamber without escort because the Concorde had learned to fear containment more than presence, and the room tensed at the sight of a human moving freely where logic demanded supervision. He began by thanking the delegates again, in a voice calm enough to be reassuring but layered with implications no alien could parse. And immediately the predictive nodes went dark, screens blanking, algorithms halting, because his presence alone introduced impossible variables. The speaker's many eyes blinked rapidly, the signal for extreme caution, and asked what humanity wanted, thinking it a simple question that could be answered to calm the system. Elias smiled, because humanity's strength was not in answering questions, but in controlling the narrative. And he said that humans wanted the same thing all species did, to survive, to thrive, and to be understood. But that understanding could not happen on terms dictated by certainty. That single phrase sent tremors through every mind in the chamber, because it implied a power beyond technology, beyond fleets, beyond diplomacy itself. And in that realization, fear took shape. Delegates whispered about the human anomaly, about the possibility that Elias could simulate outcomes inside his own mind faster than any engine, and that those simulations could alter choices in reality simply by existing. The Ulari mathematicians reported recursive failures in every sector where human thought was recently present, and they admitted that their nav computers were no longer producing reliable arrival windows, causing trade, defense, and supply chains to unravel subtly but consistently. A low hum filled the room as the speaker's assistants attempted to repair the prediction nodes, only for the arrays to flash error after error. Not because of technical failure, but because the human influence was actively incompatible with deterministic calculation. Elias paced slowly, narrating for their benefit, describing hypothetical strategies humans had rehearsed in simulations long before they became real events, describing wars won without fighting, trades made without resources, deceptions executed perfectly on invisible timelines, and all the while, the Concorde's confidence in its own foresight deteriorated like ice under a flame. The speaker finally demanded a direct answer. "What are you capable of?" Elias leaned forward slightly and answered in the simplest terms, that humans could imagine 1,000 impossible futures, select the one that served their purpose, and act as though it had always been inevitable. And in saying this, he did not lie, nor did he tell the whole truth, because humans never did one without the other. Somewhere in the chamber, an alien historian whispered about the myth of the first human explorers who had arrived in fragile ships and survived against predators that could have ended civilizations. And it occurred to every listener that survival had never required honesty, only adaptability, and that humans embodied it as instinct. The speaker asked if this was intentional, if humanity had come to demonstrate this power, and Elias replied that the galaxy itself had forced it into view, because humans were never read to be understood, they were read to be underestimated. That statement caused the first physical tremor in the Concorde's confidence, because being underestimated meant being invisible to probability, and invisibility to probability meant every plan built on foresight could fail. Across the galaxy, distant commanders felt the subtle sway of chaos as simulations that had guided them for decades now returned multiple contradictory solutions simultaneously, some recommending attack, some retreat, some total inaction, and none aligned with human behavior. The speaker realized that if humans could lie to reality, they could also lie to perception itself, creating decoys, false intentions, and phantom fleets, and that every model the Concorde had trusted was already compromised. Elias watched the recognition spread, the subtle tremor of fear that was the closest approximation to panic these species could feel, and allowed himself the satisfaction of knowing they were beginning to grasp the immensity of what had been revealed, even if only partially. In the corridors outside, the junior technicians who had previously noticed system overloads now reported mysterious energy fluctuations in the outer lattice, sectors that should have been stable but were now vibrating with raw uncertainty. And the Council's analysts realized too late that those sectors corresponded to regions humans had visited months ago, moving in ways that had been recorded but not understood. Elias returned to his suite that night, eyes closed, hearing only the hum of a galaxy questioning everything it had relied upon for millennia, and allowed himself a quiet thought that fear was useful because it sharpened the imagination, and imagination was how humans always survived. Somewhere deep within the Concorde, the speaker finally whispered aloud, knowing no one could answer, that perhaps humanity was not just a threat, they were the first species capable of rewriting reality by belief alone. And in that whisper, across the chamber and through the fleets, a new awareness began to spread, one that would not wait for consensus or permission. The galaxy had met a predator it could not see, a force it could not contain, and for the first time, every being present understood that survival itself had just become uncertain.
The whispers of uncertainty became a chorus, spreading through the Concorde like wildfire, because once a species realized its predictions were unreliable, every choice felt exposed, every calculation suspect, and no strategy seemed safe. Elias Ward moved freely through the station, escorted only by his calm, deliberate pace, and each corridor he entered caused subtle, untraceable glitches in the station's systems, arrays misreporting data, lights flickering in patterns that suggested multiple, simultaneous realities, a glitch the aliens could feel but not explain. The speaker convened a closed war council, summoning the galaxy's greatest tacticians, philosophers, and archivists, and they tried to design a countermeasure, but no plan survived contact with human unpredictability. Every simulation ran itself into logical impossibility the moment a human variable was introduced, and in frustration, some delegates began questioning whether the anomaly was biological, cognitive, or something else entirely, a force of nature masquerading as a species. Elias observed all of this silently, understanding perfectly that humans had created similar situations for centuries, relying on their ability to rehearse futures and act on them regardless of likelihood. He considered offering advice, a small tip here or a nudge there, but paused because the most valuable lesson for the Concorde was being learned organically. Humans could not be predicted, and that unpredictability was a weapon. In the corridors, analysts debated whether the humans' mental patterns were consciously deceptive or instinctively adaptive, and none could agree, which itself became a source of instability. The speaker, feeling the first real pangs of doubt in millennia, ordered direct interaction with the human mind, proposing neural mapping attempts to extract true intent, and security droids were deployed to ensure compliance. Elias allowed the attempt,
smiling inwardly because humans had rehearsed this scenario extensively, and while the mapping probes probed, his thoughts fractured reality in ways no alien device could contain. He imagined conflicting strategies, contradictory loyalties, false regrets, and layered motives, and the probes recorded it all, unable to filter the signals, processing every alternative simultaneously. Systems overheated, data cores burned out, and one of the most advanced predictive models in galactic history collapsed into an incomprehensible knot of possibilities. The room went silent as the speaker realized the impossible. The human mind was a multiplicity, an engine of contradictions, a being whose reality itself could not be bound by linear truth. Command channels lit up across multiple empires as fleets reported anomalies that did not exist according to prior maps, as if reality itself had warped in response to the human presence, and panic began to set in, not through danger, but through comprehension. Elias understood instinctively that the galaxy feared not destruction, but uncertainty, because destruction is measurable, but uncertainty is infinite. The Concord attempted a compromise, suggesting a controlled exchange of information, limited access, monitored zones, but every protocol failed almost immediately as human thought layered intent, counterintent, and misdirection. The speaker's advisors began to question whether humanity's presence could be quarantined, whether the species itself should be considered a systemic hazard. And as the debate escalated, a strange pattern emerged in remote observation sectors. Fleets and stations appeared in locations that defied prior mapping, and communications recorded conflicting transmissions from multiple sources, suggesting coordinated operations that could not exist. Elias knew that the human advantage lay not in technology, but in narrative, in the ability to believe alternatives into existence and act on them as if reality conspired to confirm them. Somewhere in the station, a junior officer asked aloud whether humans could lie to probability itself, and the room fell quiet, because that question had no answer. Then the speaker asked the question no one dared to vocalize until now. If humans can lie to reality, what prevents them from lying to the gods we imagine, the precognitive forces we have always assumed to be absolute? Elias's smile was quiet, controlled, almost imperceptible, because he knew humans did not need permission from gods or machines, only opportunity, imagination, and the courage to act. And in that moment, as the Concord began to tremble under the weight of a species it could neither predict nor fully understand, reports came in from deep space. A long-dormant fleet of an ancient precognitive civilization, considered extinct for millennia, had suddenly altered its trajectory, converging along vectors that by all prior models should have been impossible to coordinate. The Council realized too late that these movements were not errors, not coincidences, but signals being tested against human unpredictability. Elias Ward, standing quietly at a viewport overlooking the endless void, allowed himself a single thought. The galaxy had just discovered a species that could fight precognition with imagination alone, and the first test was beginning without anyone realizing it.
The precognitive fleets arrived silently, their movements smooth and precise, each ship calibrated to exploit every predicted weakness in the galaxy's defenses, yet every model failed the moment human presence was factored in. Across the Concord, alarms blared, not because of attack, but because of the impossibility of the readings. Predictions showed conflicts that should have happened, strategies that should have been executed, outcomes that should have been certain, and none aligned with what was actually unfolding. Elias Ward was briefed remotely by Earth Command, receiving encrypted updates that confirmed what he already knew. The galaxy had underestimated humans again.
assuming that foresight equaled control, not realizing that humans could manipulate foresight itself simply by being alive, by thinking in layers the universe could not parse. He walked through the station corridors, silent, each step unremarkable, yet subtly altering the behavior of surveillance systems, predictive nodes, and defensive protocols, simply because the human mind was not a factor these engines could process. The speaker convened the council once more, but the discussion devolved into a cascade of conflicting predictions, with each delegate presenting a forecast invalidated by the mere presence of Elias or any human variable. The realization spread like wildfire. Humans were not just unpredictable, they were corrosive to causality, destabilizing the sequence of cause and effect wherever they appeared. Elias allowed the council to stew in fear and confusion, knowing the psychological pressure was as effective as any weapon, because humans had long exploited perception, expectation, and trust as tools of survival. Meanwhile, deep space observers confirmed anomalies multiplying, ships arriving early, convoys disappearing for hours and reappearing intact, communications simultaneously accurate and contradictory, and every precognitive probe reporting divergent timelines that could not coexist, yet did.
On the station, Elias was approached by a Keth analyst who whispered a question that would haunt the Concorde for generations. Can a species that lies to reality itself ever be contained, or must it be allowed to roam freely until the universe adapts? Elias smiled faintly because the answer was already written in human history, where improvisation and falsehood had won wars, averted extinction, and reshaped civilization without any outside approval. He explained calmly that humans did not seek chaos, only opportunity, and that when survival demanded, they rehearsed countless impossible futures, selecting the ones that best served their goals, whether the galaxy considered those goals moral or not. Somewhere in the council, a young Ulari mathematician shouted that their calculations were failing to converge and that every effort to simulate a human decision collapsed into loops of infinite probability, a statement met with silence so heavy it pressed against walls and sensors alike. Then came the first true acknowledgement. The galaxy understood that humans could fight an enemy that could see every future, because humans could lie to every possible outcome simultaneously, creating a narrative that even omniscient foresight could not penetrate. Outside the station, precognitive fleets tested their limits, probing, adjusting, retreating, and advancing with mathematical elegance. Yet every maneuver they executed was subtly countered by human intuition, improvisation, and the simple act of unpredictability. Elias watched it unfold and realized that what was happening was not merely survival, it was demonstration, proof that humanity could challenge not just other species, but the very concept of predestined action. The speaker, recognizing the existential shift, finally spoke aloud. The galaxy had just encountered a species whose imagination was a weapon and whose lies were truths the universe could not deny. And in that acknowledgement, fleets paused, diplomats faltered, and every predictive engine in the Concords shuddered under the weight of a species that refused to be understood. Somewhere, deep within Earth Command's archives, a single message flickered across all secure channels. Phase 3 begins now.
Phase 3 began quietly, almost imperceptibly, because humans had learned that the most effective moves were invisible until they struck. Across the Concorde, anomalies multiplied. Supply chains rerouted themselves without orders. Fleets appeared in positions they had never been assigned, and communications broadcast contradictory instructions that somehow led to coherent outcomes, leaving analysts questioning whether the galaxy had lost its mind or simply been outplayed. Elias Ward moved among the delegates again. No guards, no escort, only the calm weight of a species that had rehearsed this moment for centuries. He spoke softly, weaving half-truths, rehearsed lies, and carefully chosen fragments of reality, each statement layering uncertainty into the council's perception, and each delegate felt it without being able to trace its origin. In real time, remote precognitive fleets tested him, sending probes that could anticipate every known maneuver, yet every prediction failed, sometimes spectacularly, sometimes subtly, but always enough to prove the point: humans could nullify foresight with thought alone. Analysts scrambled, trying to model Elias's intentions, only to discover that the human mind operated simultaneously on multiple planes: immediate reality, imagined realities, and counterfactual possibilities, all interwoven seamlessly, impossible to isolate or measure. The speaker leaned forward, eyes wide, and whispered a truth that had taken them millennia to admit. Humans were not just unpredictable, they were unknowable. Outside the Concorde, ships of ancient empires adjusted course in ways the galaxy had assumed impossible, responding to signals only humans could have created, yet no human had given a single order. Across the council floor, panic simmered beneath layers of decorum, because every delegate understood the implication. The species they had underestimated could anticipate, adapt, and manipulate reality in ways their perfect honesty could not comprehend. Elias allowed the moment to stretch, observing the subtle collapse of authority, the hesitation in fleets, the confusion of entire civilizations, because this was the true power humans wielded, the capacity to force the galaxy itself to reconsider certainty. Then came the first direct challenge, a fleet designed to act as a perfect countermeasure, composed of ships that could calculate every human choice before it occurred, launched a sequence meant to trap humanity's variable. Elias observed, imagined outcomes, and acted in ways no algorithm could foresee, rerouting entire human divisions without alert, creating decoys that simultaneously existed and did not, until the fleet itself faltered, unable to reconcile possibility with reality. The council erupted in stunned debate, arguing whether humans had simply outmaneuvered them or whether they had rewritten the rules of interaction entirely, and Elias watched without comment because words would have diminished the lesson. A junior Ulari mathematician recorded in trembling notes that the very notion of predestination might be meaningless in the presence of human cognition, and the observation spread across every fleet, every station, every archive, seeding doubt, fear, and awe simultaneously. Elias returned to his suite, quiet, letting the hum of the station fill the space as he considered the next move. Somewhere in the outer reaches, a precognitive species that had not been seen for thousands of years adjusted its trajectory to confront the humans, believing it could impose inevitability on them. Yet even these godlike observers found themselves second-guessing, miscalculating, failing to account for a species that could lie to reality itself. And in the silence that followed, as the first true confrontation with a precognitive power began to unfold, the galaxy collectively realized a terrifying truth. Humans did not merely exist within probability, they transcended it, bending causality through imagination, intent, and the audacity to act against inevitability. Elias Ward allowed himself a small, knowing smile, because the final phase had begun, and the galaxy was about to discover that humanity's greatest weapon was not technology, not numbers, not fleets, but the mind itself. The final phase unfolded like a storm no one could predict, because the galaxy had never faced a species capable of turning certainty into chaos and expectation into weakness. Precognitive fleets, godlike in their foresight, advanced with calculated precision, each maneuver designed to corner humanity into a predetermined outcome. Yet every calculation failed, as humans anticipated their own impossibilities and acted as if every predicted future were already a lie. Elias Ward stood on the bridge of the human flagship, calm as the void outside, watching cosmic maneuvers unfold like chess games against a player who did not exist in time. And he understood fully that every strategy the galaxy had trusted for millennia was now a fiction. The Concorde attempted coordination, sending commands and advisories, but their messages became tangled in layers of misdirection, alternate realities, and deliberate contradictions engineered by human thought. Fleets stalled, empires hesitated, and even ancient precognitive species felt the first crack in their omniscience. Across the void, a human fleet executed maneuvers that seemed impossible, ships appearing where no sensors had predicted, communications contradicting themselves, yet guiding actions flawlessly, every move a rehearsal of futures that existed only in the imagination. Elias knew that no one watching could understand the scale. Humans were not just reacting, they were orchestrating events from multiple temporal layers simultaneously, creating a reality that was half prediction, half deception, entirely human. The speaker, watching from the Concorde's chamber, finally voiced the unthinkable. Perhaps humans were the first species capable of rewriting causality itself, manipulating not just events, but the perception of inevitability. The realization spread like a virus through every fleet, every council, every archive. The galaxy's greatest mistake had been to assume that intelligence could be bound by honesty, that foresight could constrain action, that reality itself could be trusted. Elias spoke over the communication channels, not as a threat, but as a quiet affirmation. Humanity does not yield to certainty. It thrives on the impossible, and it survives because it can imagine futures others cannot see. Across space, fleets froze mid-maneuver, algorithms failed, and commanders realized that the humans had already anticipated every countermeasure, every ambush, every trap, and still they advanced, unshaken, unbound, and unstoppable. Then, in the final calculated move, Elias orchestrated a demonstration of human potential. Fleet diverged and converged, creating decoys, false flags, and phantom strategies so intricate that even the most advanced precognitive observers could only watch in awe, unable to determine which moves were real, which were rehearsals, which existed only in the human mind. The galaxy collectively understood that humanity's strength was not in fleets or weapons, but in a mind capable of lying to reality itself, of simulating infinite impossibilities, of acting against inevitability and emerging unscathed. For the first time, every empire, every species, every council realized a terrifying, exhilarating truth. Humanity could plan for outcomes no one else could even calculate, and nothing, not probability, not foresight, not godlike precognition, could fully predict or stop them. Elias looked out at the stars, quiet, as fleets settled into positions, conflicts avoided without a shot fired, alliances reshaped without negotiation, and the galaxy trembled under the revelation that humanity had arrived, not merely as a new species, but as a force beyond prediction. Somewhere, the speaker whispered into empty air, for no one could respond. The galaxy has met a mind it cannot read, a species it cannot contain, and a truth it cannot deny. And in that silence, the universe shifted, because humanity had not only survived the impossible, they had redefined it.